Hey guys, this is Ben, and in this video we're going to talk about the one thing you always wanted to talk about, verificationism. So, nobody wants to talk about verificationism, but it's actually a fancy word for something that's very, very common. And that common thing is this. The only way to know if something's true is with science. So, verificationism is really what you call a school of epistemology that's based on the verification principle. And I think the entire that realm of thought is called logical positivism. So epistemology is just the philosophical discipline that studies how we know things to be true. How is it that we know things to be true? So how do we, what can we know to be true? How do we come about knowing things? So here's the definition of verificationism. I'm going to read it. The philosophical doctrine that only statements that are empirically verifiable are cognitively meaningful, or else they are truths of logic or tautologies. So let's break that down. Empirically verifiable. So in other words, what they're saying is, when you say empiricism or empirically verifiable, what they mean is, like, if I say there's a chair in the room, that is a statement about reality. That is a truth claim, or what in philosophy is called a proposition. But I've made a statement about the way the world is, and to be honest, like, I'll make an added point in this. There's a lot of long, fancy words, and I don't like long, fancy words, although I do like them. I'm not against them, and I don't think there's something to be afraid of, but in my rule of thumb in my life has always been that if you have to use big words to explain what you're trying to explain, it's usually a good indication that you don't understand what you're trying to explain. And a good indication that you do understand what you're explaining is that you can explain it with simple language. Because the point of big words is really to just make it easier to say things. So it's just so that I don't have to explain everything, with so many words. You can just sum a bunch of stuff up in one word. So you make up a word when you say this whole blurb of words all the time. You can just, like, why don't we just make up a word for that? So empirically verifiable, again, let's say that someone says there's a chair in the room. Well, under empiricism, what you would do is you would, like, okay, how do I know if there's a chair in the room? I'll use my senses, my observational senses. I can look. I can use my eyes, my sense of sight, and look around. I can reach my arms out and feel the chair. Maybe I could smell the chair. Maybe I could try to bite the chair and see what it tastes like. Maybe I could hear the chair. Maybe the chairs don't make much sound, but there might be other things. I could say, there's a fan in the room that's going, or something like that. That would be a different statement. And then you can verify the statement. You can test it with the senses. And then there are some things, that we can use the senses to test because we augment our senses. We strengthen and increase our senses with special tools like microscopes or telescopes. So, like, you're using your eyes as a sense to empirically verify things. With microscopes, you actually can't see the tiny things that you look at with microscopes. So the microscope is a tool that allows you to see things that the naked eye can't see. So, and there's all sorts of other stuff, electronical testing equipment, just all sorts of different things. Weights, so like even a scale, when you step on a scale, you should be able to feel how heavy something is. But if you put it on a scale, the scale might augment your senses. Okay. So anyway, you say empirically verifiable, it just means, like, through the senses. Alright? And so verificationism is the philosophical doctrine that only statements that are empirically verifiable or through the senses are cognitively meaningful. And if it's not empirically verifiable, and it could be a truth of logic, or what's called a tautology, or what David Hume has a better way of putting it, what's called analytically true. So when I say that there's a chair in this room, that's a synthetic truth. In other words, it's a statement about reality, and then when you make empirical observations, then they synthesize. So the observations verify it because they synthesize with the statement. And so there's a synthesis between the statement and the observed reality. And so that's a synthetic truth. And this is David Hume's terminology for this. Although he lived a long time before verification, he lived hundreds of years before verificationism came about. He lived at like the time of the founding fathers of America. If I remember correctly, he was Scottish, a Scottish atheist philosopher. But verificationism actually started in the 1920s, and then it was pretty much killed in the 1950s in the academy and the university, and we'll get to that. But it survives on, and we'll talk about that. So that you understand what a synthetic statement is, or a synthetically true statement. And so the other type of statement would be like an analytic truth. And so for a statement to be analytically true, an example of that would be something like 1 plus 1 equals 2. It's the most basic example of an analytically true statement. Now, an analytically true statement like that would be a tautology. In other words, what Hume was saying is that like 1 plus 1 and 2 are really the same statement. It's just a semantic, or like a point. It's just a different way of saying the same thing. So like when you say 1 plus 1, you are saying 2. So it's analytically true in that sense. And so under verificationism or logical positivism, they would say that like 1 plus 1 equals 2 that's just sort of, that's not really allowing us to gain any knowledge, because we can't make statements about reality just based on that's sort of just circling in back on itself. It's just analytically true, not so much circular it's a tautological statement. So like it's not adding, you can't make statements about reality it's just making a statement about the statement, I guess. So when you say 1 plus 1 and you say that equals 2, you're just talking about the statement 1 plus 1. You're just describing it. So or you're analyzing it. Okay. So what verificationism does is it rejects, I guess, we've got the list here, 5 major fields that have long been important fields of study in the university, and it rejects them all as cognitively meaningless. Cognitive just means like your mental faculties. Okay, that things you can understand. So verificationism does not simply say that these fields are, wrong or incorrect or something, but that the whole discussion is meaningless. All right, so one is metaphysics, and we'll come back to metaphysics. But metaphysics, spirituality, theology, ethics, and aesthetics. So aesthetics is just the study of beauty, right? So of course that you can't empirically verify beauty. You can't empirically verify ethics, the whole study of ethics, the question of what's good and what's wrong, and what's right and what's wrong. So like there's no way to empirically verify to say that, if I stab you, there's no way to empirically verify that that's actually wrong, that I stab you, Theology is, of course, the study of God. Spirituality, I hope that one's pretty straightforward. And then metaphysics. Now, as I understand it, metaphysics, first of all, let's focus on metaphysics. And so we're going to need to define this term. As I understand it, this guy named Aristotle, who lived, if I remember correctly, around 300 BC, he came up with the term metaphysics. And it's because he also coined the term physics. So he gave us the term physics and he gave us the term metaphysics. And he coined them both together at the same time. Meta means that which is alongside or with. So that which is comes along with. or the other thing next to the thing, I guess. So physics would be like what we're talking about. A physical claim or something that's in the realm of physics would be like, there's a chair in this room. Or you could say the temperature in this room is whatever it is, 63 degrees. Which I guess that's pretty cold, but I was outside with a coat on. Maybe I need to turn the thermometer up. Thermostat. So that would be a physical statement, and then you can I could use the thermometer to verify that physical statement. A metaphysical statement would be something like, there exists a transcendent creator of the universe, a supernatural transcendent creator of the universe. And that statement's a metaphysical statement because you can't empirically verify that. That's outside the sense experiences. We're talking about a being that would ultimately look no different from nothing at all. Because it's just undetectable to our five senses. It goes beyond the physical sense reality that we have, and or at least what we currently have. And so, you'll see why I say that later. But so that's an example. So verificationism would say that any metaphysical claims are all of metaphysics is just meaningless. So before we get into the problem with verificationism, I first want to make a point that it's actually quite popular, and you find it everywhere. So one of the most common ways you find it is that in school you typically don't learn any way to prove anything true or test any claims or falsify any claims outside of science class. So in science, you learn the scientific method, you learn about experimentation, you learn about observation. And so the main method of testing, claims in science class is you have some sort of statement about physical reality, and then a physics statement, and then you test it with some sort of empirical testing method. Whereas the only exception really is in math class. You do learn how to do mathematical proofs. And so the verificationists would say that the mathematical proofs aren't really telling us anything about reality. It's just analyzing what's written on the paper. So metaphysics would deal with questions that we cannot, there's no way to empirically test them. So if I said there's a God, a transcendent supernatural creator of the universe that lies beyond our ability to see, beyond our senses, then there's no way to empirically verify that. And so traditionally you would test that claim about God's existence with metaphysics, which what you would do is you would come up with logical arguments and rational reasoning to make claims about that. And so I can give you logical arguments that such a God exists. I've got a video on it's Proof God Exists, the Universe, under my Proof God Exists playlist. And so you can take a look at that if you're really interested, and see that here is a purely rational logical proof for God's existence. But verificationists typically reject these proofs for God's existence, and it's often the case that they reject them because they adhere to the verification principle. So the people who adhere to the verification principle, one, just in general, most people kind of do without thinking about it very hard, because when they think of proof, they think science. Science is where that's how you prove things. It's just very common. I remember one time a young man was arguing with somebody, and he said, "I've got proof that God exists." And then the other guy argued back and said, "No, you don't." And then the young man said, "No, I've got scientific proof." And so it was very strange that science was when he said scientific, all of a sudden, well, it must be proof, right? So that's an example. Another example is that essentially verificationism was destroyed in the academy in the 1950s, and we're going to get to why that is, why that happened. But the point is that it has lingered on in sort of a similar way that young Earth, like creationism, or what people might call fundamentalism in religious circles, has lingered on. So in the academy, the idea that the Earth is 6,000 years old has been debunked through science, and it's not really taken seriously. But among religious circles, the idea that the Earth is 6,000 years old, there's a lot of people who still believe it. In fact, I think they said 45% of the population still thinks that in America. I'm not sure how true that is, but I've heard it. So that's a pretty high number. So verificationism lived on, and what typically, since this is a philosophical question and a philosophical debate, there are people who just don't really deal with those sorts of questions. They're in the field of science, and so they're actually just doing scientific research and scientific work. And those people tended to hold on to the verification principle, even though it's not taken seriously by anyone in the arena that gave birth to it in the first place, which would be the philosophy department. So the philosophy department gave us the verification principle, and then it debunked it. But the scientists who don't really know, the philosophy isn't really their primary field of study, and they're really outside of that, sort of in the way that religious people are outside of the university. Well, the science department is outside of the philosophy department in a big way, and so they don't realize that, like, this has been debunked. This form of reasoning has been debunked. So the main problem with the verification principle, well, hold on, before we get to that. So those groups of people who are in science, typically today, if you still hold on to verificationism or logical positivism, there's a derogatory name that's given to you to sort of point out how similar you are to the fundamentalists. Or so, like, it's like you're in some sort of fundamentalism. You'll just hold on to this no matter how dumb it is, because you've just made up your mind. And so it's called Scientism today. So no one really uses the term logical positivism or verificationism anymore, because no one takes it seriously anymore, of anyone who actually studies it. But people who hold on to it, who, it's really outside of their primary field, that whole world of people who hold on to it, that's called Scientism. And the other group that really holds on to it are like sort of famous atheists, because it fits well with sort of their famous atheism. And so essentially, most atheists today are not simply people who don't believe in God, but they actually don't believe in anything supernatural at all. And so that's called philosophical materialism, or just the idea that the physical material world is all that there is. Or it's also called naturalism. So a naturalist is someone who doesn't believe in the supernatural. And so verificationism fits well with philosophical materialism. You say the physical world is all that there is, and people say, well, what about God, or what about supernatural beings? Does the supernatural exist? And they say, well, there's no way to verify that, because I only believe, the statements that can be verified empirically are meaningful. And so your statements about God are just meaningless, and anything supernatural are just meaningless. So you run into this, like, people like Michael Shermer, or almost any of the, the new atheist breed, although they're kind of yesterday's news now, they tend to hold to this. So the main problem, and there's a third group. Oh no, that's all three. So let's get to it. This is what you've been waiting for, right? The main problem with verificationism is that it's self-defeating or self-refuting. It refutes itself. You see, verificationism is a metaphysical claim. It is itself metaphysics, and yet it denies metaphysics. And so now that we've defined the terms, you understand what I'm talking about, hopefully, if you followed along. So you see the problem right away. In other words, if we want to spell it out in plain English, or more plain English, I guess, is that if you say that the only way to know a statement is true is if you can empirically verify it, well, how can you empirically verify verificationism? Like, in other words, how do you test that empirically? In other words, you say that no statement, nowhere in the universe, there's someone who knows something to be true without using the five senses through some other method. So that would be metaphysics, right? They made a claim about reality. There was a proposition about reality, and they were able to prove it or falsify it without using the senses. What if somewhere on some far distant planet there exists, or some point in the distant past or future, somebody does that? How can you generalize and say that that's never possible? And say that, if you're going to generalize and say that that's never possible, how do you test your claim? How do you test your claim that it's never possible? With using the five senses. And so that's basically the problem of verificationism in a nutshell. It can't make generalized statements about reality, and it itself is a generalized statement about reality. And so you can't delegitimize metaphysical claims by making a metaphysical claim, essentially. So you can't, in other words, like, you can't, this is not, verificationism as a philosophical doctrine is not, it's not a synthetic truth. It's not empirically testable. It's not scientifically testable. So that's essentially the problem. It's self-defeating, and so that's why in the 1950s it died a horrible death in the academy. But it lives on in departments who are mostly concerned with studying biology and other things, things like physics and stuff like that. And they don't have time to think about the philosophical undergirding and basis for what they do because they're busy doing what they do. It's just not their primary field, and so they're just behind the times, or it's more like they're so far behind the times that they're very similar to someone who believes the Earth is 6,000 years old. They're fundamentalists, or what's called, they're holding to what's called Scientism. Okay, so essentially, there are plenty of metaphysical claims that you can't. I could tell you that, like, you can't test with the verification principle. You can't test empirically. So, like, I could tell you, what if there's parallel universes? What if there's parallel universes that exist and that we, well, this is something that's a question that's being raised in physics right now. What if there are parallel universes that exist? Well, currently, our empirical testing methods we have no way of knowing anything about these parallel universes empirically. So, like, if I was to make a claim that, like, there exist parallel universes, we have no way to empirically test that. So until we do, it's a metaphysical claim. And so to make, you can't really test it or deal with it except in the realm of metaphysics. Metaphysics is limited because ultimately it's going to have to use philosophical reasoning to make a claim. So, like, if I tell you that to test a metaphysical claim, so like if I tell you that there are 13 parallel universes, there's no way to empirically test that because we can't observe these universes at all. If I tell you that they are all 4.4 degrees warmer on average than our universe, there's no way to empirically test that even about our universe. If I tell you what the temperature overall is with much specificity about our universe, like, out to many decimal points on average, there's no way for us to test that. That would be a metaphysical claim. We might one day develop a way to test it, but for now it's in the realm of metaphysics. It's that which is alongside physics. But the point is that, like, we still can use philosophical reasoning to make some metaphysical statements. So what I can say is that, remember our 1 + 1 = 2? Well, we know that basically all of the truths of math and all of the truths of logical reasoning have to be true. And if these parallel universes exist, the truths of logic and mathematics have to be true in those universes. You can never find anything that goes against those truths. So, like, an example of that would be the example I like to give is, let's say that you take a suitcase and you zip it up, and you put 3 gold watches in it. You zip it up, you seal it with tape, you close the trunk, you make observations and records and everything, and you drive in the car with it sealed up in the trunk for 200 miles. You don't stop. You get out. You open it and you find 4 watches in there. What we know to be true, what happened, the explanation for why that happened is outside the realm of physics currently, or at least for what we know so far. But what we know to be true, what we can say is that 3 does not equal 4. All right, so that's something you can tell through philosophical reasoning, or mathematical proof and reasoning. There are numerous questions that are metaphysical questions that physics can't test. So, like, there's the brain in the vat problem. If you've ever seen the Matrix movies, in the Matrix movies, mankind created robots, and then the robots took over, and so there was this war with the robots. The robots won, and now the robots farm people for electrical energy, we're livestock, and we're all just in jelly, in vats, and we're just born in this and we just live in these little jelly pods, and the robots have wires hooked to our brains, and it creates a virtual world that we all live in. But to us, the world is real because it creates a virtual reality through our eyes and ears and touch, and it connects directly to our brains. And so you can't make any statements, in other words, according to physics, you can't really jump out of that. We would only be testing the virtual world. All of physics can only test the virtual world. It can't test the real world, or even this theoretical real world. Any questions about this theoretical real world, any propositional statements or anything, anything we would say about it, any truth claims about this real world cannot be tested with physics. Because it just would be literally outside of the realm. So what you can do is you can make statements about reality you can make metaphysical claims that would have to be true even beyond physics. So Immanuel Kant called this the noumenal and phenomenal. In other words, everything as far as our empirical observations is all what, as I understand it, he actually coined the term phenomenon. And so he had a phenomenal realm and a noumenal realm. And so if you look at the Matrix movies, the fact that you are in a vat of jelly being farmed for electrical energy is what's going on in the noumenal, the real. But what you're seeing is the virtual world, or what he called the phenomenal world. And so that's where as far as I understand, that's where we get the term phenomenon. Kant coined the term, to talk about his weird ideas. Another way of putting it is, you could think of, instead of having robots putting us in a vat, you could think of the Fishbowl Problem. So Stephen Hawking talks about this, and as the late Stephen Hawking, he just recently passed away, but he talks about this in his, I can't remember the name of his book. It was the recent book. Anyway, it's not important. The Fishbowl Problem is, if you think of a fish, everything the fish thinks that it observes outside the fishbowl in the world beyond the fishbowl is actually distorted by the fishbowl. And so what if there exists for us as humans, what if we exist in some sort of bowl, some sort of fishbowl that distorts our observations of the world beyond? And there's no one who's actually trying to distort our observations. It's just the inherent natural properties of the bowl that it always distorts them in a consistent way. And so everything that we think about the world is actually not the way it accurately is. It's been distorted. And so Stephen Hawking was saying, he even said in the book, it's possible that, the fishbowl problem could mean that the Earth is only 6,000 years old, even though all of the weight of our evidence suggests that the universe is 14.7 billion years old, or is it 13.7? I think it's 13.7. That's all phenomenal information. It could all be distorted by this theoretical fishbowl. And so any questions about the existence of the fishbowl or what the world would be like beyond the fishbowl, that would all be in the realm of metaphysics, because physics can't empirically verify or test that. And what's important is that even the philosophical doctrine that only statements that are empirically verifiable are cognitively meaningful is itself a metaphysical statement, because you can't test that statement with empiricism. Because what if there exists somewhere someone who found some other way to figure something out, How would you test that statement empirically? Only statements that are empirically verifiable are cognitively meaningful. How do you empirically verify that? It's based on philosophical reasoning. Hopefully you can see that without me having to spell it out. That statement itself is based on, you're not going out and you're not saying, my claim is that only statements that are empirically verifiable are cognitively meaningful, and then going out and testing that with empiricism. And then if you did, that would be circular reasoning. Because you would be saying, I know the only way to know anything to be true is by empirically testing it. And you say, well, how did you know? How did you find that out? By empirically testing it. Okay, so essentially, that's the problem. The verification principle just runs it, it's self-defeating and that sort of thing. And so what this means is I can actually make statements for you. I can actually produce for you philosophical arguments to prove the existence of God. And what that means is that these statements are all based on philosophical reasoning, and you may reject all that because you hold to the verification principle. But then if you hold to the verification principle, you hold to a principle that disagrees with itself. Because, it's not just that it can't be empirically verified. They never tried to empirically verify it, and that's why it only lasted 30 years in the academy. And it probably came about because skepticism was on the rise, and what they were trying to do was use empirical verification to stop skepticism, because people were just starting to, what the idea that was on the rise in the academy was just more and more doubt of knowledge. Although it appears that in the 1970s things shifted the other way, and God started to make a comeback, as I understand it from William Lane Craig's always talking about it. He references Time Magazine's article on it, is that more and more philosophers are now Orthodox Christians, and they embrace classical arguments for the existence of God. So I could give you classical arguments for the existence of God, but they would be based on philosophical reasoning. Thomas Aquinas is probably one of the main guys that, one of the sort of benchmarks of these arguments, and he had his 5 ways, to prove God exists. And the interesting thing about Aquinas is he said, if the universe has a beginning, that's just too easy. So what he tried to do is prove the existence of God without talking about the beginning of the universe. He tried to avoid that, because he just thought, well, that would just be too easy if the universe has a beginning. Why would I even bother? It would just be obvious to anyone. But yeah, one philosophical argument I can give based on pure philosophical reasoning is I can say that the universe cannot be infinitely old. And there's no way for us to empirically verify whether the universe is infinitely old or not. Although the evidence is actually, I guess now, due to Big Bang Theory, we have a way to empirically verify that. And, you know, that's the problem with empirical verification, is it you know, science, like, can shift as we make more precise observations. We begin to observe things that disagreed. You know, because what science does is you never actually observe reality. You make a guess about reality, and then you just see if your observations fit your guess. And so we had observations that fit a guess, but then we made new observations that didn't fit the guess, and we had to change the guess. So for a long time, they said matter can't be created or destroyed. And then we observed that the universe is a big explosion that's speeding up, and so that leans the other way. And a lot of other observations, and now it looks like the universe has a birthday 13.7 billion years ago. But the point for us right now is that it doesn't matter about any of these empirical observations. Time cannot have been going for an infinitely long amount, for an eternal. Time cannot be past eternal. There has to be a beginning to time. And this is a metaphysical claim that can be proven true, can be verified through philosophical reasoning. And so what you run into is, if time is infinite in the past, then you have an actually infinite number of days. So you could say, well, how many days are there before today? Infinity. And so you could say, well, how many odd numbered days are there before today? If we numbered all the days, well, there would be infinity odd numbered days. Well, how many even numbered days are there before today? Infinity. Okay, so like, what you could do is you could say, well, let's look at all the days and then subtract all the days. So you did infinity days minus infinity days, and you got how many days were left after you did the subtraction? 0 days. Okay, so let's do it another way, and let's say that you took all of the odd numbered days, which is infinity, and then you subtract the even numbered days, which is infinity. Well, how many would you? Well, no, I'm sorry, I did it wrong. Let's say you take all the days, which is infinity, and you subtract away the even days, which is infinity. So infinity minus infinity. How many days are left? The odd days, which is also infinity. And in fact, you could do this with, like, you could have, let's subtract all the days before 100 days ago. How many days is that? Infinity. So you took all the days, which is infinity, you subtract all the ones before 100 days ago, which is infinity. So you did infinity minus infinity. How many you have left? 100. In fact, you could do infinity minus infinity. You could do the same thing minus the same thing and get any number you want. Which would mean that math, or the concept of subtraction, is meaningless. The problem is that the concept of subtraction is mathematically proven to be 100% certain. So what this means is we can actually test this metaphysical claim. There is no way that time does not have a beginning. Okay? Alright, so, and you know, for a long time our scientific observations weren't consistent with that, but we made more precise observations and now they're consistent. You know, and who knows, maybe we'll find out other observations that goes against it, but you know, our observations are always limited. You know, so they can never make broad, generalizing, sweeping statements, you know, 100%, you know, certain statements. Let's see. So then, you know, if the universe has a beginning, like we're saying, well then the next claim in the Kalam cosmological argument is that everything that begins to exist has a cause of its existence. And so I could again give you philosophical reasoning for this. I could say, like, all right, if things can begin to exist without a cause, in logic this is called the principle of sufficient reason. That for anything to exist, it must have an explanation of its existence. But I guess technically you could say, you know, the universe began to exist for no reason at all. But there's some philosophical problems with that. If a universe could begin to exist for no reason at all, then like two unstoppable objects could begin to exist for no reason at all, and they could collide with one another. And you could say, well, how could it be that unstoppable objects could pop into existence and then collide with one another? Well, you wouldn't need a reason why. Like, there's just no reason why they couldn't, because it happened for no reason at all, right? And so what that would mean is, like, two unstoppable objects could, stop each other, which is logically impossible. That violates the fundamental laws of logic, the law of non-contradiction. But there's no reason it can't happen, because if things can happen for no reason at all, then there's nothing really to stop it from happening. And they could because there's nothing inherently impossible about an unstoppable object and another unstoppable object popping into existence. But there is something, so that's part of the problem. You can think about it another way. Does it really make sense to you? The classical way you would say it is only nothing comes from nothing. So the principle of sufficient reason would say that for anything to exist, it has to have an explanation of its existence. It can't just have no explanation. And so it either explains its own existence, or it has an explanation for its existence that's beyond itself. So if it has an explanation for its existence that's beyond itself, then it's caused to exist by something beyond itself. So if it explains its own existence, then that means that it can never not exist, because it is its own reason for existing, so it can't ever start existing. So this is all, philosophical reasoning. And so that means that since the universe did begin to exist, the universe must have an explanation for its existence other than itself. And it can't just, start existing for no reason at all. Because you run into numerous philosophical problems when you have that. Like we can make other metaphysical statements, like there exists two all-powerful gods who hate each other and want to kill each other. That's logically impossible. And if things could pop into existence for no reason at all, then two unstoppable forces could pop into existence for no reason at all. And they could, be on a beeline course to run into one another eventually one day, maybe 1,000,000 years from now. And that would be a problem. Right? But there would be nothing inherent in each of them popping into existence that means that they can exist, other than that, the fact that there's no explanation for why they exist would mean that there's a problem, that there's nothing. The problem is that there's no reason they can't exist. Because things can happen for no reason at all. Or you can think about it this way. This is actually empirically verifiable. None of us ever, would, like, if you came and found your house on fire, you came home and found your house on fire, you wouldn't think that that happened for no reason at all. And in fact, if things can happen for no reason at all, then this would ruin the whole study of probability, because you can't really assign a probability to things happening for no reason at all. So, like, how often do things happen for no reason at all? Who knows, right? Nothing has no properties that would make it specifically be the origin of the universe. It has no properties. Anything can happen at any time for no reason at all, if things can happen for no reason at all. So, and it may never happen, because nothing has no properties. So, like, let's say that something incredibly unlikely happens, and you could say, well, why did that incredibly unlikely event happen? Maybe some guy, won the lotto 32 times straight, and you say, why did that happen? You could say, well, it's unlikely that it happened by accident, he cheated. No, it could have happened for no reason at all. Well, what's the odds that it happened for no reason at all? You can't place any odds on that. There's no way to tell. So, like, there would be, the whole question of causality would be completely pointless. Like, you would never look for causes for anything, when anything, literally anything, could be explained by just, it happened for no reason at all. Or as people say, only nothing comes from nothing. Nothing has no properties. Yeah. So there's a lot of problems with it. Like if things can happen for no reason at all, then like you could turn into a 1957 pink Cadillac right now for no reason at all. And there's nothing that could stop it from happening. Anything could change. Absolutely anything could change and be completely altered and happen, and it would happen for no reason at all. Which would mean that an unstoppable force could come into existence for no reason at all. There's nothing inherently impossible in an unstoppable force in and of itself. And another unstoppable force could come into existence 1,000,000 miles away, and they could be on a beeline course for one another, and eventually they would hit one another. And there's nothing impossible or like logically impossible in each one of those existing. But there is something impossible about the two of them colliding with one another. And so what this means is there has to be some sort of undergirding principle. Things can't just happen for no reason at all, because that would mean that logically impossible things would that can't happen would have to be able to happen. And so what this means is something caused the universe to exist, because it, or began time, I guess, to be more accurate. Maybe not our universe, but there's something must have begun time. And so what is that something? Well, first of all, I think we have already said it can't be two all-powerful gods, because the idea of two all-powerful gods runs into the same problem of if they disagree with one another, then like which one wins? Well, that's a logically impossible situation. That's because they wouldn't, if one of them wins, then the other one's not all-powerful, but that would just be saying one all-powerful God and one not all-powerful God. But if you really have two all-powerful gods, that's a logically incoherent, or it's not cognitively meaningful situation. So you could say something caused time to exist. Well, it's either a thing or it's a being, right? And so the question is, because in other words, it's some sort of entity that doesn't make choices, so we would call that a thing, or it's an entity that makes choices, and that would be a person. We'll just say a person or a thing. Now this thing cannot be infinitely old, because we proved that metaphysically it cannot be infinitely old. Nothing can be infinitely old. But this thing would also have to explain its own existence, which means it cannot fail to exist. Which means that its relationship to time must be fundamentally different. It can't be infinitely old, so it has to have, but it must exist. We've proved metaphysically that it must exist. So therefore, the only possibility is that it has some sort of relationship to time that's not like, the normal relationship to time. And so this is where you get Thomas Aquinas' block theory of time, the idea that God exists, transcends time, that God exists at all times at the same time, which is a classic. A lot of people don't hold to this view of God anymore, but it is the classical view of God's timelessness. Not that God's timelessness is not an idea that God has no time or has no relation to time, but rather that God is connected to all times at the same time. And so our way of moving through time, where we go from past to present to future, would have no relationship to God. But if this thing is a thing or a person, it has to exist, beyond time in this way. It has to transcend time. Now, what this means is, if it is a thing, and it is the cause of our universe, because it's timeless, it has to timelessly be causing our universe. Well, the only way it can cause our universe to exist is based on its inherent properties. So, if a thing does something, it does it based on its inherent properties. It doesn't make a choice to do it. It has to be based fundamentally on its inherent properties. So, like, fire will burn paper because of the inherent properties of fire. It doesn't choose to burn paper, it just has those properties. You don't hold paper over a fire and then the fire decides will I do this or will I not do this? What it does is based just a direct result of its inherent properties of what fire is. And so if that's the case, then this timeless, or this thing that transcends time that must exist, would simply timelessly be causing the universe to exist. So the universe would be timeless as well, in a timeless state of its first moment of existing. Since we experience the movement through time we all experience change, where at one point we all experience the movement through time, then there's no way we could even have that experience unless the cause of the universe is not a thing. So that means the only other option is that it is a being. So the cause of the universe must be some sort of being. It has to exist, and we can metaphysically prove it. So the interesting thing here now, what some people will say is, well, we don't exist, we exist outside time too, and so time is an illusion. And the interesting thing about that is that that's not really a disagreement with the argument. That's a semantic trick to avoid the argument, because essentially that's what the argument is saying. It's saying that we exist in some sort of realm where we experience time, but the larger realm, that's the basis from which our realm springs, is itself timeless, or transcends time. So the idea, this is called the A theory of time, would be the idea that, you know, time exists as we normally experience. And the B theory of time would be that the way we experience the movement of time, as you hear me say one thing, and then later in the future you hear me say another thing, and as we experience me talking for an hour about this, is that essentially the B theory of time is that time is an illusion, and that experience of time that you have is illusory. It's not reality. It's an illusion caused by who cares what, you know, the fishbowl. But essentially what that's saying is that the block theory of time, of, you know, Aquinas' view of God, that we're all God basically, but some sort of fishbowl prevents us from, like, being aware of the fact that, like, we exist at all times at the same time. And so the important point to understand there is that, like, it doesn't matter. That's not really a disagreement with the argument. That's really more of an affirmation of the fundamental idea of the argument. If there is a world of illusion inside the fishbowl where we perceive time, that's all that matters. That's all that matters, because our experience of time cannot be possible. Our experience of time, even if it is an illusion, cannot be created by a timeless, impersonal thing. Because even our illusory world of time would, even in that world of illusion, it wouldn't get older. And so the bottom line is, this isn't really even a disagreement with the argument. It's just a sort of a failure to understand the point. Is that we experience time. There is no way we could experience time based on this timeless thing that must exist. So the timeless thing must be a timeless someone. Now, you could add to this and say, well, if this being, there must be a being that is the cause of all existence within time. This being would therefore know everything, because this being would essentially take no time to know everything. This being would be immensely powerful and immensely all-knowing, because it would literally be able to empirically verify every truth claim, and take no time to do it. It would, like, because it transcends time, it could observe all events at the same time and it always observes all of them all the time. And so this being would literally not make choices. It could just make one choice that comprehensively thought about every possible situation, every possible outcome, every possible scenario, and just made one choice that, and it would always be making that one choice. So this being, and no matter what situation presents itself, this being already knew about that, already thought about that, was already prepared for that. You could say that there's no way for this, some people like to say there's no way for this being to interact with us since it's outside of time. When I say outside of time, I don't mean like outside the house. I mean it's outside of our normal experience of time. And that the way its relationship to time is so different from ours that it's outside of our relationship to time, but it's not outside of time proper. This is called the block theory of time. So like, it simply is experiencing all events at the same time. The future, the past, and the present are all happening at the same time. Which is essentially, it's kind of odd because some people say that like our experience of time is an illusion and we actually experience at all times at the same time, and there is no time. But anyway, the bottom line is this we've proven that this being must exist. Is the point that there must exist a cause of the universe that is itself beyond time. It has to exist. It doesn't even matter if it's a being or a thing. The point is, it's timeless and it's the cause of the universe. Now, some people like to say that God limited himself when he created the universe by allowing us to exist and that sort of thing, and stepped into time. And it essentially, this is God allowing us, that's when God allowed free will to exist. And, God could impose God's will on free will creatures, but does not. And so they say that, like, God stepped into time when that happened. But that God still, made that decision from an all-knowing perspective, which kind of, the idea of God stepping into time, I guess, is important because people think about the incarnation and, Jesus Christ becoming a man and, a being that exists on our plane and our level. So it's an important question. The issue there is you got to think about a being who transcends time would literally have all the time in the world. So, like, let's think of it this way. Think of a being that can move across an infinite distance and complete it because it moves with infinite speed. So, like, of course, I know we talked about the mathematical problems with an actually infinite number of things, but hopefully you get the point, is that this being would, like, you can still talk about infinity, as a mathematical concept. There just can't, we can prove with philosophical reasoning that metaphysically there cannot be an actual infinite number of things anywhere in the physical or any sort of supernatural realm. But you can still think of it as a concept, and so that's what we're going to do here. So think of an infinitely long distance, or think of an infinitely long distance. A being that transcends that distance wouldn't simply move through it with some great speed from point A to point infinity, but it could actually move so fast that it moves with infinite speed through that. And so what that would mean is, if it moves with infinite speed, then it's at the first point and at the last point at the same time. So it would transcend time and distance and space if it just moves with infinite speed. And so you can think of it, how much time, if God becomes a man as Jesus Christ, how much time does it take him to maintain his God status? How much time does that take up? It takes him 0 time. So it doesn't take up any of his time to be God, in a way. So he's got all the time in the world to be a man too. is a way of thinking about it. You know, like in other words, like it doesn't take any time. It takes zero amount of time for Jesus to transcend all of time. It doesn't take him any time to transcend all of time. He can transcend all of time. He can move from, you know, an infinite past to an infinite future in zero time, because he moves with infinite speed. So like he would transcend time. So it wouldn't take up any of his time to be God. And so it wouldn't really be a conflict to, you know, for him to be a man as well, at least on that level. So, you know, the two can coexist. We can start to see how the two can coexist. Because he could know everything that, you know, that God knows, and still have plenty of time left over, you know, for our experience. So that's the, you know, that's a way of thinking about, you know, God stepping into time, is that, well, his timelessness doesn't take up any time. You know, it's kind of weird. But anyway, so those are some of the objections, but what we've proven is that there must exist some being that's all-knowing, super prepared, and transcends time itself. And if it's so prepared and so knowing, it's not a big leap to say that it controls everything. Because, you know, a really simplistic way to put it, simple at least, maybe simplistic, which would mean this too overly simple, is to say that a being that knows all knows how to do all. Alright? You know, you could make a further proof that the being is all-powerful, given that all of our existences are contingent on its creation of us, and yet nothing affects its own existence. It has sole control over its own existence, because if something else created it, then eventually we would have some sort of infinitely long regress of causes. And we can't have an infinitely long regress of causes, because then we run into the actual infinite problem. So you're going to have to, at some point, get back to the ultimate being. And this ultimate being would be create all of us with the ultimate plan. And so therefore, this being wouldn't really need to ever interfere in our lives ever, because from the point of creation, it already had transcended time and knew everything that would happen. And so it would, and that's kind of why I don't like the idea of God transcending, or God stepping into time, is that if he transcends time, then like he transcends the stepping into time. But anyway, the point is, the very moment of creation, this being could control everything that will ever happen, because it would set everything up in such a way so that it would operate exactly according to the plan. So it would create everything in such a way, based solely on itself, that predicts and controls everything that would later happen. So like, you can think of a machine. A truly well-designed machine just runs and operates the way it's designed, the way it's built. Now, I guess one of the basic questions you could raise is like, well, how could there exist free will in this machine? Well, this is the free will question. Obviously, we have free will because we can believe lies, and so you obviously are not God. You're not the super being, because there's no way that like you would believe a lie. Obviously, because if you have the real experience of believing a lie to be true, if you were God, then the lie would just be true. So you exist as some sort of, I guess like the term I might like to use is a lesser first cause. You know, there's a first cause and there's a lesser first cause. In other words, you can cause things to happen, your beliefs at the very least, because you can believe lies. And so if we springboard from there, we could say, well, how is it possible that, you know, the lesser first cause can exist? You know, given that the greater first cause, you know, would, predict everything that happens. Well, essentially the greater first cause, or God, could simply allow the lesser first cause to exist. But nothing the lesser first cause ever does, or nothing humans ever do, would ever surprise God, given that God is already there watching them do it in the future before they were ever born. It's not that he controls it so much as he already watched it. And so you can think of it like this. Think of Moses parting the Red Sea, in the miracle of the parting of the Red Sea. Moses, right? And so, Moses, how did God part the Red Sea? Did God enter into history and alter the laws of reality, alter the physical laws of this universe? Well, that's one view, and I think that's C.S. Lewis and William Lane Craig's view. But there's another view called the Preternatural View, which I tend to favor, because I think it's Augustine's view, and I think it's the concept of secondary causation. Is that when God created the universe, he planned for Moses to part the Red Sea, and he designed the universe from the beginning so that it was wound up like a watch, and so that when Moses came right there, the watch, all of the gears of the watch just had miraculously worked themselves to that point. And so that the event of creation is the primary miracle, and all of the other miracles that we observe are all just things that God had always planned to do, which would be a greater concept of God. And that's the concept of secondary causation, that God caused it, but he didn't cause the miracles directly, but rather that he caused them, he always planned to cause them from the beginning of time, literally. So, or from beyond time itself. And so he designed the universe in such a way so that he always knew that moment was going to come, and he was ready for it. Which raises an interesting question about new creation. The Bible does talk about, behold, I make a new creation, that kind of thing. So I guess we talk about this, one question leads to another, but the point is if you throw away the nonsense of verificationism, then all sorts of other, we're able to make all sorts of, we're able to talk about metaphysics, we're able to talk about theology, and all sorts of other questions, and we can actually have certainty about these claims. There must exist a God, there must exist a you. I guess if I could go a step further, we could say, what are the morals of this divine superbeing? Does this divine superbeing, this all-powerful, all-knowing being exists, but does it have any morals? Does it have any concept of good or evil or right and wrong? It's kind of a mysterious thing. I mean, well, essentially, it's fundamental to the nature, the integral nature of this being is, choice. That it is a personal being. And we've proven that. So, what that means is, let's see if I can say this in the simplest way possible. It values something because it's inherent in the making of choices is that you have to value something, because you could have made an alternate choice. And so choice necessitates value. So first of all, this being does care about something. So the question becomes like, well, what? Well, if you're going to value a thing, and this is the key, you're going to value it for like what it is. Does that make sense? You're going to value it for what it is. So, if you say I value kitty cats, then you don't value kitty cats for something that they are not. You value them for what they are. And so anything that exists only exists by God, or the greater first cause, allowing it to exist. And in other words, like, kitty cats can't exist without the greater first causes say so. So in essence, what I'm saying is the object of value for the greater first cause, or God, would be God. The object of value is God. God is the object of value. God values God. Which funny enough, like we've proven metaphysically, something that the Bible's always claimed, is that the primary commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And it's important. It's not just to love God, but to love nothing else. And that God is the only object of value. Right? And so anything else, like kitty cats, if you value kitty cats, you only value them because of their relation. Their value for them is dependent on their relationship to God. And it has to do with that issue of you can't honestly value something unless you value it for what it is. And, God has to be fundamentally honest. God cannot be dishonest. Because if God lies, then the lies would just become true. Right? So, fundamentally, anything else in this world, like your loved ones or your family, and you say you love them, it's not that you love them and they're in some sort of competition with God, but rather that your love for them is dependent on God. So that if you stop believing in God, then a proper view would be, well, I don't even know if I love anyone anymore. Because the only reason I loved anyone was because I loved God. God is the basis, the fundamental basis for all morality. So that has consequences. So if people actually since people exist as free beings, then they have to have some level of freedom. And obviously we exist because we can believe lies. So we have to have some level of freedom. We have to. The most basic level of freedom, you can't get any more fundamental and basic than to say that you value what you control, what you value. Right? I mean, how could you get any more basic than that? So the problem is if you value something, but you don't value God, especially if God's created things, and it's clearly that we observe numerous things that God's created that are not us, because like I'm not the chair over there, because I would be aware of it to some degree. And it doesn't even matter, it's still some other aspect of reality. Even if I'm the only thing that exists, it would be an aspect of me. So if I value that and ignore God, and I don't value it dependently on God, in other words, if I make it a false God, anything in this world, and I put it as in competition to God, then if God respects my choices, then I will receive what that thing in reality is without God. So in other words, reality, how do I put this? Anything that exists without God is nothing. And so if God gives me what I want, and I want that thing without God, then I get nothing. Now, would God give me what I want? Well, essentially, since God would be the freest being in existence, because freedom and power are essentially the same thing, it's just the ability to do what you want, then that means that God values freedom. The value of my freedom, there must be some value on at least my most basic, crucial, fundamental level of freedom. And so the most basic fundamental level of freedom is the self-determination of what I believe in and what's important to me. And so, essentially, God will respect my choices and give me, whatever that thing is. That doesn't matter if it's money, sex, power, blah, blah, blah. Donuts, who cares? Whatever thing you value, if you value it and leave God out of that, if your value for it is not dependent on God, if you just live for that, then God will give you what you asked for. And what you're asking for is what that thing is without God. The problem, and which is nothing, the problem is that you cannot comprehend that. I cannot comprehend that, because we can't comprehend what it means to lose God, because God is so much, which would mean the only way we could comprehend that is if we were God. So only God can comprehend what it means to lose God. And so what this means is, essentially, it would take forever. And since there can't be an actual infinite, you would never complete the process. And so you would you would get what you asked for, what that thing you live for, what it is without God. You would get that, but it would just get worse forever and ever. There would be a loss of, in other words, the joy of anything, the wonder of anything, the goodness of anything that exists, it is dependent on God. And so you would get what that thing is without God. Does that make sense? So like, and that would take forever. So you could think of it, this does sound a lot like hell, an eternal punishment, but what I would add is that hell is something that gets worse and worse. So that essentially even, let's say if someone, might be you could imagine two people could be further along that track, but in the long run it's not going to matter. So like you could think of like, Adolf Hitler and some other guy who's nowhere near as bad, but it wouldn't matter in the long run because he's just further along down the same path, and you're going to get there to be just, to be just as debauched as him. But anyway, the real question is the resolution of this. And I almost feel like I should save it for another time. But let's say that someone, recognizes their error of their ways and, wants to be good. Well, the problem is that you have to really be honest about being good, right? So like, and to be, you can't be good unless you're honest. And so the only way you can honestly be good is by admitting, the bad choices that you've made. And so when you make a choice to be good, you're still agreeing with the fact that you made a choice to be bad. And since all of your choices have to be essentially sacredly valuable because of the fact that your freedom is sacredly valuable, you're just reinforcing that with your decision to be good. Now, if you make a decision to turn your back on being bad and be good, but you try to ignore the good that you did, or the bad that you previously did, you're just deluding yourself. You're just delusional. So that's in many ways worse than, just continuing to be bad. Because now you're bad, but you're not even accepting that you're bad. Because the bad that you chose is fundamentally going to have to play itself out in your life. Because your choices are sacred, in a way. And so that's just deluding yourself about the nature of the problem. So what becomes interesting here is a resolution. Perhaps you would need some sort of help from God to be aware of the nature of the situation, and then you could like make some sort of choice that's cognizant and aware of the bad that you've done. And then you could essentially, what if there was a way that like you could complete all of the evil and get it over with? And so this is where I think Christianity enters into the mix. If you have Jesus Christ in the situation, then Jesus Christ would be God. He would take no time to understand what it means to lose God. And Jesus would essentially, you could grow in Christ and in Christ's suffering, but at the same time, God is there with you, like in the suffering, which raises interesting questions in and of itself. I mean, how could God lose God? But that's a different question for a different time. We could write a book here. But anyway, I guess we'll stop there. Hopefully this was interesting. I'm amazed, but I do know there's more than one person out there who actually listens to this. But anyway, we'll stop. Have a lovely day.